Hello, and welcome to another lesson in our series in which we've been looking at Paul's ministry as recorded by Luke in the book of Acts. In our last lesson, we saw Paul giving his goodbye address, his farewell address, to the leaders in the church from Ephesus. They're having traveled the 30 miles over to Miletus, where Paul was, and he talked to them and told them goodbye. Today's lesson picks up in chapter 26 of Acts, which describes Paul actually now being back in Jerusalem. Remember, this is on that third missionary journey after he had spent some time in Ephesus, 3 years or so, had left Ephesus, had gone over to Macedonia and Achaia, and then had come back, headed home to Jerusalem, trying to get Jerusalem before the Passover. And instead of going into Ephesus, he's from Miletus, which is a coastal city along the Aegean Sea there. He sends word in and has the leaders from Ephesus meet him. And that was the subject of the lesson last time. After that chapter concludes, in chapter 21, Luke describes for us the trip that they took on to Jerusalem. Along the way, Paul is warned by more than one person that when he got to Jerusalem, trouble awaited him. When he arrived in Jerusalem, Paul immediately met with the leaders of the church, sharing with them what God had been doing through his ministry with the Gentiles and with the Jewish believers scattered throughout Asia and Macedonia and Achaia. The church leaders then told Paul that there was a problem, and that is there were some Jewish folks who had become Christians, and so therefore they were part of the church, but they were upset with Paul because they had heard that Paul was preaching against the Mosaic law. They had heard that Paul was telling everybody that if you were a Christian, you didn't have to worry about any of the teachings of the Mosaic law, and that he was trying to teach Gentiles that the Mosaic law wasn't important. They advised Paul that there was a way that he could attempt to, in effect, earn the good graces of these folks back. That is, there were four believers who were going to take a Nazirite vow. Now, this is a Jewish vow that's described back in the Mosaic law, in which they would shave their heads, they would refrain from any wine or any other product from the vine, and then they would offer certain sacrifices, and this would be for a period of time. And there was a fee that had to be paid. And they suggested to Paul, these church leaders suggested to Paul, that there were four men in Jerusalem that were planning to take this vow and go through this procedure, and that Paul ought to do that with them. And he ought to offer to pay for the cost of the sacrifices and the fees that these four men would incur. This would assure these folks who were upset with him that he had not turned his back on the Jewish law, because this was a part of the Mosaic law. So Paul agreed to do that. He goes to the temple, and we're told that somewheres in the middle of that 7-day week in which they are offering sacrifices every day, at the end of which he's supposed to pay this fee, somewheres toward the end of that 7 days, he's at the temple participating in the vow, and some Jews from Asia, presumably it'd be Ephesus. Ephesus was the major city in the province of Asia. Luke just describes them as some Jews from Asia, recognized Paul, and they started to stir opposition amongst all the Jews at the temple, not just the Christian Jews, but all the Jews. Acts 21:28 says, fellow Israelites, help us. These were the Jews from Asia and what they were saying. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law and this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled the holy place. Now, we need to understand something about the temple. The temple was a large area, several football fields in size. But the actual construction, the actual building was very, very small. It was only, I believe, like 30 feet across and 90 feet deep. That was the actual building. The back part of that was the 30 feet was the holy place. The 30 feet in front of that was the Holy of Holies, and that was the building. Then in front of that was the courtyard of Israel, and this is where, the courtyard of priests, where the priests would burn the sacrifices. Then in front of that was the courtyard of Israel, where only Jewish men could go. Then there was the courtyard of women, where only Jews could go, men and women. And then out around it in a larger area was the courtyard of Gentiles, where anybody could go. So what the accusation is that Paul has taken these Gentiles, these non-Jews, these uncircumcised non-Jews, they're suggesting he has taken them into the courtyard of Israel, where only Jews could go, and that would be blasphemy. So they're stirring up the crowd, and they're saying he's defiled the temple by bringing these uncircumcised Gentiles into the temple. Now, there is no evidence that Paul did that. What we do know is that there were some Gentiles who had traveled with Paul from Asia and were in Jerusalem with him, but there's no record that he took them into the temple, defiling the courtyard. But these Jews got everybody stirred up, and people became so upset, we actually had a riot developing. They grabbed Paul, and they were ready to kill him. Well, what happens is news of the riot gets over to the barracks where the Roman soldiers are housed, and the Roman soldiers come in and put down the riot. They stop the riot, and they take Paul. They try to figure out what's going on, and the crowd's yelling one thing. So they said, fine, we'll just take him and hold him overnight. So they took Paul into custody, and they were going to take him back to the barracks and keep him overnight. As they got to the barracks, Paul asked them if he could speak to the crowd. And as Luke described, Paul does get a chance to speak to the crowd. And he basically tells them his story. And when he gets to the part, though, about God commissioning him to go and preach to the Gentiles, oh, the crowd started up again. And they started hollering and yelling, and there was such a riot going on that the Roman soldiers simply took him inside the barracks, sent the crowd home, and they decided they would question Paul to find out what the truth was, what was going on. Now, the Romans had a way of questioning. It was called scourging. That is, they asked you a question, and if you didn't give them the answer they wanted, they'd beat you. And in our day and time, we'd say they'd beat the truth out of you. Well, they were going to scourge Paul, and as they were strapping him down, ready to start the scourging, Paul asked them, how can you do this to a Roman citizen when he's never had a trial and had a chance to defend himself? When they found out he's a Roman citizen, they decided they weren't going to do that. You see, Paul was a Roman citizen, and while they saw him as being a Jew, he told them he was in fact a Roman citizen, and that they then decided they should not do that because that was against their law. So they decided to keep him overnight with the idea that the next day they'll have a trial before the Sanhedrin and take him back over, and we'll try to get to the bottom of it. Well, when the Romans learned that there was a plot afoot to kill Paul, the Romans decided they needed to get Paul out of town. So under the cover of night, they take Paul out of town, and they take him over to the coast to what is now the Roman capital, what had become the Roman capital of Judea, and that was a city on the coast called Caesarea. They take him there, and they take him to the Roman governor. The commander of the Roman soldiers in Jerusalem sends the papers to have the Roman governor make a decision as to what should happen to Paul. Well, Paul is tried before the Roman governor. The Jews come from Jerusalem and present their case, and the governor, his name was Felix, he didn't make a decision. Now, Luke tells us that he delayed in all of this because he was waiting for somebody to give him a bribe. In other words, the customary practice at that point in time was the way to make issues go away was simply a bribe. And he was waiting for a bribe. He never got the bribe. He never made a decision. And Paul actually sat under house arrest there in Caesarea for 2 years, waiting for something to happen. Um, and at the end of 2 years, Felix was replaced by another governor, a man by the name of Festus. Now, Felix's wife was named Drusilla. Drusilla was a Jewish lady. Well, the Romans thought her to be Jewish. She was really a great-granddaughter of Herod the Great. She was the sister of Agrippa and Bernice. Agrippa, who was the grandson of Herod the Great, he had inherited his father's throne as king of an area of Judea and Perea. But Felix is then removed from power, and Festus is put in charge. Now, soon after Festus becomes governor, Agrippa, the king up in Galilee, and Bernice, his sister, they come to visit. Now, you remember now, this is all politics. This man who is a descendant of Herod, and remember Herod was an Idumean who had married a Jew, and therefore the Romans considered him to be a Jew. Agrippa is considered to be Jewish, or at least he has exposure to Jewish background. He understands the Jewish way. He has befriended the Jews to keep his throne. He and his sister come to visit Festus, the new governor, because they want to keep peace within the family of Rome. That is, keep Rome happy with him so he keeps his throne in Galilee. So Bernice and Agrippa come to visit Festus, the new governor in Caesarea, and while they are there, Festus decides, this would be a good time to get somebody who knows more about this issue to hear from Paul and give me some advice. Now you see, the Jews were making demands on Festus that he do something with Paul. And Festus, not really understanding everything, trying to figure out what the right thing to do was, saw this as a chance. Here is Agrippa and Bernice, who have a Jewish background, who understand something about the Jewish religion, who understand something about the Jewish law. Let me see if he can help. So he he asks them if they will talk with Paul, and they agree to. So the setting for our lesson is the encounter that Paul has with Agrippa and Festus. And here's the setting. We have a great palace hall, a great throne room, if you will. And it's all the festivities, all the pomp and circumstance that you would have attending an official political occasion. That is, the trumpets play. Festus, the Roman governor, comes in and takes his place. And then the king, Agrippa, and his sister Bernice, with all their robes and all their attendants, they come in. And then Roman commanders come in, and Roman soldiers. And of course, in the midst of all of that, there were slaves and servants. So you have this large audience, very, very formal, all the pomp and circumstance of a royal occasion. Luke describes it this way. Acts 25:23 through 27. The next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with high-ranking military officers and prominent men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, "King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man? The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I found that he's done nothing deserving death. But because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. Therefore, I have brought him before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. For I think it's unreasonable to send a prisoner on to Rome without specifying the charges against him." So, see, when Festus becomes governor, the Jews are demanding something to be done with Paul. Festus is ready to send Paul back to Jerusalem and have him tried there. And Paul said, no, I'm a Roman citizen. I want to appeal my case to Rome. I want to appeal my case to Caesar. Festus says, okay, you have that right. I'll do that. But as he said, as Luke describes here, he didn't know what to write. He didn't know what the charges were. The Jews kept making all these noises, but there was nothing that was officially Roman violations of the law or violations of Roman law. So he asked Agrippa, help me figure out what it is I need to send to the Caesar, who is going to try this man in Rome. Well, chapter 26 begins with Paul speaking. Festus tells Paul it's his opportunity to speak to Agrippa. Paul begins telling about his background. He told them that he was raised a Jew, a very strict Jew. He was raised a Pharisee. He said he was such a devout Jew and believed so much in his faith that as an exercise of his faith, he persecuted those who left the faith and became Christians. He was persecuting Christians. He said he was even traveling all over, picking these Christians up and bringing them back and put them in prison, even going to foreign cities. Having made that introductory statement, we then pick up with our lesson today in chapter 26 of Acts, and let's start reading with verse 12. Paul was talking about now he's been going to foreign cities arresting Christians. Verse 12. On one of these journeys, I was going to Damascus with the authority and the commission of the chief priests. About noon, King Agrippa, as I was on the road, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, blazing around me and my companions. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Then I asked, who are you, Lord? I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, the Lord replied. Now get up and stand on your feet. I have appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and as a witness of what you have seen and will see of me. I will rescue from your own people and from the Gentiles. I'm sending you to them to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. He's telling the story of his Damascus Road conversion. Now, as you read through the book of Acts, we will find this is the third place that Luke records this story being told. The first is in chapter 9, and that was at the time the incident actually occurred. The second was at that point where he had been arrested by the Roman soldiers for his own protection there in Jerusalem. And as he was being taken into the barracks, he spoke to the crowd and he told them of his conversion experience. Now, this is the third time we will read the details of this conversion experience. Now, there are differences in the details between these three occasions, but these differences are very minor and really don't make a difference into the impact of what he's describing in the occasion. Paul said he was on a mission. He was such a conscientious Pharisee, believing in the law and all that goes on in the Jewish Mosaic law and Jewish faith, that he was out arresting people who were teaching something different. He was on a mission, and he was going to Damascus. Now, he said he'd been going to foreign cities. He said he was going to Damascus, and he said he had the backing of the leadership of the Jewish faith in Jerusalem. He said he had their authority, that they had given him permission and authority. Now, there's some question as to exactly how much authority the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem had over people living in another province. However, the Jews in the synagogues up in Damascus would probably respect at least the opinion of the folks back in Jerusalem. But what's more important is that this fact shows that Paul was their friend. Paul was their agent. Paul was on the same side with them as he's making his way to Damascus. He had their confidence. They fully believed in what he was doing. Then he says he saw a light. Now, It's interesting that in the other two accounts, Luke described what happened, and when Paul tells us what happened in the other account, it said that a light shone around them. But here he says, I saw a light, a bright light. Now it's interesting that the Greek word for saw that Paul uses here, that Luke quotes him as using here, carries with it implications of more than simply a visual act, a physical visual act. More than just the light coming through the eye, going to the optic nerve, carrying an image to the brain. But rather the word saw, or the root word from which saw, this word saw comes from, is talking more about understanding, perceiving, recognizing. So when he says, I saw the light, I saw a light, it may be more than simply a physical light. Here I came to understand something different, something new. I saw a light, God's presence, God's plan, God's salvation. That which was different from the darkness I was living in. I saw a light. Now, in both of the other accounts, Paul recites the fact that he was blind and he was led to Damascus from that experience. He doesn't mention blindness here. He doesn't talk about Ananias coming. He doesn't talk about any of that. But he says, I saw the light. He's saying, I came to a new understanding of what my mission was. He says about noon. Now that's a very minor fact, but think with me about this. In that area, especially in that day and time, with travel being by foot, the noonday heat was very, very hot. Most travelers did not travel through the middle of the day unless they were in a real hurry. It was an emergency. There was some urgency to their mission. And Paul's traveling at midday. That gives us some idea of the intensity of the mission he was on to get to Damascus to arrest these people. And then he saw a light, a whole new understanding. Now, he tells us that Jesus speaks. He says he hears a voice. Now, he doesn't know it's Jesus to begin with, but he hears a voice. And the voice is in Aramaic. Now, Aramaic was the language that the Jews spoke at that point in time. Jesus would have spoken Aramaic in his lifetime. Most of the Jews didn't even know Hebrew, but they knew Aramaic. And now the book, Luke writes this book in the Greek, but he says, I heard a voice in Aramaic. Now, some of the translations say I heard a voice in Hebrew. But since the older translations, however, since we know that the Jews in that time didn't speak Hebrew, they spoke Aramaic, the newer translations have taken the liberty of translating that into Aramaic. And the voice asked the question, why do you persecute me? And this question is asked by the voice in all three accounts. He had a specific conversation with the voice. He says, why are you persecuting me? But in this account, unlike the first two accounts, he adds a Greek proverb. It is hard to kick against the goads. Now, a goad was a pointed stick that a farmer would use like a cattle prod. Let me read what Barclay wrote about use of goads. When a young ox was first yoked, it tried to kick its way out. If it was yoked to a one-handed plow, the plowman held in his hand a long staff with a sharpened end, which he held close to the ox's heels, so that every time he kicked it, it was jagged with the spike. If it was if it was yoked to a wagon, the front of the wagon had a bar studded with wooden spikes, which jagged the ox if the ox kicked. The young ox had to learn submission the hard way, and so had Paul. So these goads were the way of teaching an ox not to kick against the way the master is leading you. And so Paul quotes Jesus here of adding, not only why are you persecuting me, it is hard to kick against the goads. Don't you understand? It's impossible to refuse. It's hard to reject the leadership I'm trying to give you. Hard to resist God. Paul then responds, Lord, who are you? Now, the word Lord there is not in all capitals, so it's not Yahweh. The word here is Adonai, which is a title of respect, a title that is given to Jesus, often used referring to Jesus, but it's a title of respect, a title of honor. So while he may not, when he said, who are you, Lord? He isn't calling him Lord in the fact that at that point in time he is recognizing that he is Jesus. He recognizes he is somebody special. He recognizes he is somebody superior. He recognizes this is someone to whom he should give deference, so he calls him Lord. Who are you, Lord? The irony is he is giving deference. He is giving respect to this one he doesn't know, and he's going to find out the very one he's trying to kill people for or put people in jail for worshiping. There's the extreme opposites here. Paul's going to go from one side to the other immediately. Well, the voice replied, I am Jesus, the one you persecute. I am Jesus, the one you persecute. In other words, he is having a personal encounter with Jesus. Okay? He is having and this is where Paul says that he is as much an apostle as the 11 that traveled with Jesus and then were sent out and that survived Jesus' crucifixion and ascension and would later go out and travel through the world preaching. He is just as much an apostle as they were because he had a personal encounter. He heard the voice of Jesus. And then Jesus says, it is I, or I am Jesus, the one you persecute. Then he said, get up and stand. And then he says, I have appointed you to witness what you have seen and will see. Now, in this account, as I said, he doesn't mention being blinded. He doesn't mention Ananias or anything like that. He just has God tell him to get up. I've appointed you to be a witness of what you have seen and what you're going to see. I have appeared to you. I have appeared to you. The word appeared, as Luke uses it in his writings, this Greek word that we translate appeared, Luke uses it usually when he's talking about a divine revelation. A divine revelation. Let's see here. It says, I am the one. I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. Now get up and stand on your feet. I have appeared to you to appoint you as a servant. I have appeared to you, a divine revelation, to appoint you as a servant, to appoint you to go to them and to open their eyes and turn them from darkness. He's giving him a mission. He is to go and to preach the gospel and help them to turn from Satan to God. He gives them a promise. I will rescue you. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. And in fact, Paul had to be rescued more than once from Gentile opposition and from Jewish opposition. I am sending you to them, to the Gentiles, to your own people. And they're not going to necessarily respond. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. I'm sending you to them, and here was the mission. The mission was to open their eyes. If we continue with the same thought that the saw meant bring understanding or to have understanding, I'm sending you to open their eyes to bring new understanding to them, to bring new disclosure to them. Now, there's and then he says to turn them from darkness to light. Lack of understanding to understanding. Darkness to light. From their old life to a new life. From their life of trying to earn things on their own being self-centered to a life of relationship with God. These are some parallel statements here. He says, I'm sending you to them to open their eyes, to turn them from darkness to light. See, it's the same thing but different words. And then to turn them from the power of Satan, impliedly, to the power of God. Okay, that's the same thing as coming from darkness to light. That's the same thing as having them open their eyes. So that they may receive the forgiveness of sins and a place amongst those who are sanctified by faith in me. He says, I'm sending you so to give them the message so that they can know this same relationship with God the Father by having faith in Jesus the Christ. Barclay writes regarding these verses, 17 and 18. These verses give a perfect summary of what Christ does for men. A, he opens their eyes. When Christ comes into a man's life, it enables him to see things he's never saw before. B, he turns them from darkness to light. Before a man meets Christ, it is as if he were facing the wrong way. After meeting Christ, he is walking towards the light, and his way is clear before him. C, he transfers them from the power of Satan to the power of God. Once evil had him in thrall, but now God's triumphant power enables him to live a victorious goodness. And D, he gives him forgiveness of sins and shares with the sanctified. For the past, the penalty of sin is broken. For the future, life is recreated and purified. That was the message that Paul was to take to the Gentiles and to the Jews. Well, let's pick up with verse 19. So then, King Agrippa, now remember he's talking to Agrippa. He's talking directly to Agrippa, and he's told the story about his encounter with Jesus on the Damascus Road. So then, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven. First to those in Damascus, then to those in Jerusalem and in all Judea, and then to the Gentiles I preached that they should repent and turn to God and demonstrate their repentance by their deeds. That is why some Jews seized me in the temple courts and tried to kill me. But God has helped me to this very day. So I stand here and testify to the small and great alike. I am saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses said would have happened, that the Messiah would suffer, and as the first to rise from the dead, would bring the message of light to his own people and to the Gentiles. Addressing Agrippa, he says, I had this encounter and I was obedient. I did exactly as Jesus told me. First of all, he went into Damascus and he preached the message there. Then he went back to Jerusalem and he preached the message there. Then he went into Judea, the area around Jerusalem, preaching the message there. And then he ends up going to these other places, Asia and Macedonia and Achaia, all these areas preaching the message not only to Jews but also to the Gentiles. And the message he preached was, repent, turn away from your past, turn to God, and it's more than simply turning to God in your attitude. It's living that life out. Works, deeds. Live a life that manifests your new direction. It's more than just a change of mind. It's a change of lifestyle. It's a change of habits, a change of everything about you. This is the message he preached. Now, he says in verse 21, let's read that. He says, that is why some Jews seized me in the temple courts, because he was preaching to the Gentiles. And because he was talking about this new understanding of Jesus. That is, that Jesus was the Messiah. The Jews were rejecting that. So he had the Jews upset with him because of his expanding their understanding, or trying to expand their understanding of the Old Testament prophecies, that is, having been fulfilled in Jesus. And they were upset with him because that he was including Gentiles He was preaching to Gentiles. This preaching, this message to Jews and Gentiles threatened the Jewish leadership. If they convinced Jews to become Christians, accepting Jesus as Messiah, that would shake the leadership from their position of authority. And if he got Gentiles to believe that Jesus is Messiah, that's going to be offensive to the Jews because they believe that God only loved Jews. God only loved the circumcised. He would have nothing to do with the Gentiles, the uncircumcised. So Paul said, that's why they arrested me. That's why they put me in jail. That's why they're trying to kill me. But God has helped me. God has protected him. In essence, what he's saying, the fact I'm standing in front of you talking to you, Agrippa, is evidence that I've been protected by God. I've been protected by God. He has taken care of me. And he said, I testify, God has helped me this very day. So I stand here and testify to small and great alike. Because God has protected him, he is now able to stand there in this great audience hall in the presence of the governor and the king and all these commanders and slaves and servants, the great and the small. He says, I'm testifying to everybody. It's the same message. No matter your status, no matter your social standing, no matter your wealth, no matter your bloodline, it's the same message to everybody. But God has helped me to this very day, so I stand here and testify to small and great alike. I'm saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen. Now he's going to turn to Agrippa's Jewish understanding of Judaism. He says, what I'm saying about Jesus being the Messiah is totally consistent with what the prophets said was going to happen and what Moses said was going to happen. That the Messiah would suffer and die. That he is the first to rise from the dead. He would be the first resurrected. He would be the first fruits of the resurrection. And that by being resurrected, by his death on the cross, atoning sacrifice, and the demonstrative power of God in raising him from the dead, he would bring the message of light, this new way of life, to his own people, the Jews, and to the Gentiles. Paul has said that he saw the light, and he said now it's his job to carry the light. And this was all prophesied by the Old Testament. This was all prophesied. In saying that, Paul is referring to a lot of the prophecies. Listen to Isaiah 42, 6 and 7. This is a messianic prophecy. Isaiah is writing, remember, back in the 720s. And listen to what he writes. Speaking for God. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. Speaking of the Messiah. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, to open eyes that are blind, to free captives from the prison, and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. Specifically talking about light to the Gentiles. He's saying, I'm not, by my including the Gentiles, it's made the Jews mad, but what you've got to understand is, what I'm saying and doing is perfectly consistent with what the prophets, even Isaiah, we could go through a lot of the prophecies and see how Jesus was that fulfillment. So Paul is saying what I am preaching is very consistent with the prophets and with Moses, especially in that provision, bring light to the Gentiles. Well, let's go to verse 24. At this point, Festus, now Festus is the Roman governor. He's sitting over the side listening to this conversation between Paul and Agrippa. And at this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense. You are out of your mind, Paul, he shouted. Your great learning is driving you insane. And Paul responds, I'm not insane, most excellent Festus. What I am saying is true and reasonable. The king, referring to Agrippa, is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. Impliedly, you don't understand, so I haven't told you about these things, but King Agrippa would understand the prophets and Moses. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his, Agrippa's, notice, because it was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. Now, this is an interesting exchange. Festus, first of all, accuses Paul of being crazy. You're crazy. You're insane. Why would Festus say that? Well, first of all, Paul has made reference to this Messiah who was raised from the dead. Festus has heard all about this man preaching about this fellow who was supposedly dead because the Romans crucified him and then came back to life. And Festus would say to Paul, if you believe that, you're crazy. Then he would say, you're crazy. Why do you keep referring to the Gentiles? Don't you know you've got the Jews all upset, and every time you mention Gentiles, it's going to make them mad again? You're crazy. And then he's saying, you said God has helped you. If your God has helped you, what are you doing here? Why are you in custody? You're crazy. You're on the road and you hear voices. You see a vision. You hear voices. Paul, you're crazy. You're insane. Your learning has driven you mad. You've been reading those scrolls, those Old Testament scriptures for so long that it's driven you insane trying to figure it all out. He said, Paul, you're more concerned about preaching this mission, preaching this message that you say you were given than you are with your own well-being. Don't you realize if you just be quiet and get out of the public light, you'd be all right? You're a Roman citizen. You've got everything going for you. Why do you keep antagonizing these people? You're crazy. You're great learning. You've just spent too much time trying to figure out all these scriptures. This is what's driven you crazy. That's what Festus is saying. And Paul says, I'm not insane. I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I'm not crazy. And everything I'm saying to you is reasonable. Go back and read the Old Testament scriptures. Listen to the details about Jesus' death and his resurrection. It all fits together. It's all consistent and reasonable. And he says, and more important than that, it's true. It's true. Then he turned to King Agrippa. And he knows that the king is familiar with the Old Testament scriptures. He says the king is familiar with these things because of his background, because of his connection with the Jews, because of his Jewish family lineage. He knows about these things. He's familiar with these things. I can talk about these things with him. I can't with you, but I can talk about him with these things because he understands these prophecies I'm talking about. He understands who Moses is and what Moses said would happen. He understands all of this. None of this escapes his notice. He understands all the points I'm making, and impliedly, and he's capable of connecting the dots. He's able to take everything that I've said and analyze it and see that what I'm saying is true and is reasonable. And then he turns to Agrippa and he says, King Agrippa, do you believe in the prophets? Oh, I know you do. Now he's asked Agrippa a straightforward question. Do you believe in the prophets? Now this is a question that Agrippa cannot answer, cannot afford to answer. You see, if he says, yes, I believe in the prophets, which is what a good Jew would say, he now gives credence to what Paul's been saying and opens the door for people to say, oh, so then you believe in Christ as the Messiah, Jesus as the Messiah. And that would make his Jewish friends mad. And remember, the people living in Galilee that kept him in power were Jews, and if they got upset with him and they started any kind of disturbance, the Romans would come in and remove him. So he's trying to keep his Jewish friends happy. So he couldn't say, yes, I believe in the prophets, and caused them to think he had abandoned Judaism. But on the other hand, if he says, no, I don't believe in the prophets, that's going to make them mad. There's no way for him to get out of this. This is the horns of a dilemma. No matter what he says, he's going to make them upset. He can't say, I don't believe in the prophets, because he's not portraying his faithfulness to his friends, to the Jewish faith. But if he says he does believe in the prophets, then it's going to open the door for him to say, well, then you believe what Paul's saying. So he really, really doesn't have a good answer. He can't afford to answer. So look what he says. Then Agrippa said to Paul, do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? He doesn't answer the question. Now, the King James and some of the older translations have a statement that says, rather than a question, that says, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. And some read that as a statement, an affirmation, saying, Paul, you're being pretty convincing, and I'm almost persuaded. But the translation of the Greek word that is almost, the Greek word itself means short, in short. And that's why the newer translations say that do you think in such a short time you can convince me? Questioning Paul, answering a question with a question, is a very good way of not answering the question. If I can answer your question, if you give me a question and I want to avoid your answer, I simply respond with a question. So the new translations seem to be appropriate when he says, in such a short time. Do you think simply your summary review of what's happened here, that's enough to cause me to say I believe? And is this something I can just simply do that quickly? Do you think that in such a short time you're going to persuade me to be a Christian? The other thing we have to look at this particular passage is we don't know exactly how Agrippa is using that term. He says, do you think in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? Christian at that point in time was a derogatory word. A Christian was the word Christian was used in a derogatory sense to put down people who followed Christ. So he may have been saying it sarcastically. Do you think you're going to convince me to be one of those? Do you think in such a short time you're going to convince me to be one of those? Or it may be that affirmation, almost you persuade me. Not quite, but almost. We'll take it. You can look at that and make it your own determination. But the point being, Agrippa was not ready to make that commitment. He was not ready to make that commitment. And so Paul concludes this passage with a prayer. Paul replied, short time or long time? And that's giving credence to the translation, the newer translation, the rendition the newer translations give about short time. Short time or long time, I pray to God that not only you, but all who were listening, Festus, Roman commanders, prominent men of the city, slaves, servants, I pray that everyone who hears the message may become what I am, except for the chains. I don't want anyone to suffer like I'm suffering. I don't want anyone to be arrested and being put in jail. But I pray that all of you can come to the same understanding that I have. I can pray that everyone will come to the same realization of who God is and how I can know relationship with Him. That was Paul's message to Agrippa. That was Paul's. And the whole basis of the message is, I had an encounter with Jesus. I had an encounter that brought me from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to the power of God, who opened my eyes, that totally transformed me from becoming a persecutor of the church let's put it this way, a persecutor of the gospel to being the proclaimer of the gospel. That's the life-changing experience that one has when they have an encounter with Jesus Christ. And the question that comes to you and me, have I had that kind of encounter? Have I encountered Jesus in such a way that not only I changed my mind about who he is, but I've changed my whole direction, my lifestyle. I have repented, and now I'm living a life that demonstrates that dependence upon him. That's the call of the message that Paul received that day. And that's the call of the message that comes to us. And that's the call of the message we are to share with others. And just like Paul, see, Paul's experience enabled him to testify to that change. We should take and testify. Because you see, when we talk to people, evidence that's personal is meaningful. I know where I was before, and I know where I am now. And that's the convincing evidence that people need to hear, the convincing testimony that people need to hear. Yes, a vision, an encounter, an experience that transforms us. Let's pray. Father, thank you for another time of study of your word. Thank you for the encouragement we have. As Paul was faithful to the cause, you were faithful to him and protected him and provided for him and used him. And now, Father, we commit ourselves into your hands. We commit ourselves to your use. We commit ourselves to be sent by you that we might share the testimony of the transformation that you've made in our life. Father, use us that we might be effective instruments of your love in a world that needs to see your love. That we might be the effective tool to be used that will bring people from darkness to light, from death to life, that will help open eyes that they might see who you are and who you're calling them to be. For it's in the name of the one who enables us and equips us to live out this calling that we pray. Amen.